What makes a hero? Most of us imagine someone built for the moment, trained, decorated, ready. But history has a habit of finding its greatest champions in the most unexpected places. A farmer with no military training, a teenage girl who couldn't read, a prisoner the world had already forgotten. Asterisk, these are the people who, when everything was on the line, refused to stay ordinary. This is their story, Simo Häyhä, the farmer who stopped an army in 1939. Simo Häyhä was 34 years old and living exactly the life he'd chosen, tending crops on a small farm in rural Finland, hunting in the forest near the Soviet border, and competing in local shooting competitions on weekends. He was quiet, methodical, and by all accounts content. He had no desire for glory. He had never led men into battle. He had never, as far as the historical record shows, wanted to. But then the Soviet Union invaded Finland on November 30th, 1939. An army of roughly 450,000 Soviet soldiers crossed the Finnish border, expecting the campaign to last 11 days. Finland had fewer than 300,000 men under arms, no tanks to speak of, and was vastly outgunned in every measurable category. The world assumed Finland would simply cease to exist as an independent nation within the month Simo Häyhä reported for duty. What followed over the next 100 days is one of the most statistically staggering individual performances in the history of modern warfare. The Finnish winter that year was brutal. Temperatures plunged to negative 40 degrees Celsius. The forests were blanketed in meters of snow. Soviet commanders, accustomed to open terrain, found their formations shredded by an enemy they could never see, never locate, never anticipate. Häyhä used no scope on his rifle. Scopes, he reasoned, required a shooter to raise his head. Even a centimeter of exposed profile was a centimeter that could get you killed. Instead, he used iron sights, lying motionless in the snow for hours, his white camouflage blending seamlessly into the landscape. He would pack snow into his mouth to suppress the vapor cloud from his breath. Asterisk, he had become part of the forest itself. Soviet commanders tried everything: artillery barrages, counter-snipers, search parties, none of it worked. The man they began calling the White Death was never where they expected him to be. In fewer than 100 days of combat, Simo Häyhä accumulated 505 confirmed sniper kills, a record that has never been broken. On March 6, 1940, a Soviet sniper finally landed a round that tore through his jaw and cheek. His comrades found him barely alive, half buried in snow. He was in a coma when Finland signed its peace treaty with the Soviet Union 4 days later. He woke up on the day the war ended. Häyhä lived to be 96 years old. When a journalist once asked him how he had become the most lethal sniper in recorded history, he gave an answer that has echoed ever since. Practice, he said. Nothing more. The farmer from the forest had held back an empire. But if Simo Häyhä was an unlikely soldier, the next story belongs to someone who had no business being on a battlefield at all. Not by age, not by station, not by anything the world of her time would have recognized as qualification. Joan of Arc. The girl who woke up France in 1428. France was losing. It had been losing for decades. The 100 Years' War had ground the country into exhaustion. English forces controlled the north, and the city of Orléans, strategically critical, emotionally symbolic, was under siege and expected to fall within months. The French crown was disputed, the army was demoralized, the kingdom was fracturing. Into this moment stepped a 17-year-old peasant girl from the village of Domremy who could neither read nor write. Joan of Arc had been hearing voices since she was 13. She identified them as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, and she believed with total conviction that they had given her a divine mission. Asterisk, drive the English from France and see the rightful king crowned. She had no military training. She had no political connections. She had never held a sword in battle. She walked into the court of the Dauphin Charles anyway. Historical accounts of their first meeting are remarkable. Charles, skeptical and surrounded by experienced advisors, reportedly disguised himself among his courtiers to test her. Joan, who had never seen him before, walked directly to him. What she whispered in his ear, whatever private detail she shared that no outsider could have known, caused him to grant her an audience, then an examination by theologians, and finally, against every instinct of his experienced military commanders, an army. She rode into the siege of Orléans in April 1429, 9 days after her arrival at the city walls. What followed was not a gradual military campaign. It was a transformation of morale that bordered on the inexplicable. Soldiers who had been retreating for months began advancing. Fortifications that had resisted French assault for weeks fell in days. On May 7th, Joan was struck by an arrow between her neck and shoulder. She pulled it out herself. She returned to the battle within hours. Orléans was liberated in 9 days. The military reversal that followed, across months of subsequent campaigning, allowed Charles VII to reach Reims and be crowned King of France. The war that had seemed lost began slowly and then decisively to turn. Joan was captured the following year by Burgundian forces, sold to the English, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake at age 19. 25 years later, a retrial declared her innocent. 5 centuries later, the Catholic Church declared her a saint. She never learned to read. She never led an army before the age of 17. She simply refused to accept that someone like her couldn't change the world. And she did. If you thought a peasant girl rewriting the outcome of a 100-year war was extraordinary, the final story is perhaps the most astonishing of all, because this hero didn't pick up a weapon. He picked up a pen in a place designed to make men forget they were ever human. Witold Pilecki, the man who volunteered for Auschwitz. In the summer of 1940, a Polish cavalry officer named Witold Pilecki did something that defies easy categorization. He volunteered to be arrested by the Nazis and sent to Auschwitz concentration camp. Let that settle for a moment. The Polish underground resistance had no intelligence on what was happening inside the camp. Rumors were circulating, dark, unverifiable, almost unbelievable rumors. Pilecki, then 39 years old, argued that someone needed to go in, see it with their own eyes, build a resistance network from the inside, and find a way to get word out to the Allies. His commanders were reluctant. Pilecki insisted. On September 19, 1940, he allowed himself to be swept up in a street roundup in Warsaw and was processed into Auschwitz as prisoner number 4859. What he encountered was beyond the scope of anything he or anyone else had imagined. Systematic starvation, medical experiments, mass executions. Pilecki documented everything, cataloging the machinery of industrialized murder with the precision of a trained military intelligence officer. Over the following months and then years, he organized underground cells among the prisoners, established communications networks, and smuggled reports out through released prisoners and sympathetic guards. His reports reached the Polish government in exile in London. They were forwarded to British intelligence. They landed in some form on the desks of Allied commanders who were being asked to believe something their minds could not fully accommodate. Historical accounts confirm that Pilecki's reports constituted some of the earliest and most detailed intelligence on the Holocaust available to Western governments. Whether those governments acted adequately on that intelligence is a separate and painful question. Pilecki survived Auschwitz for 2 years and 8 months. In April 1943, calculating that the resistance network was as strong as he could make it, and that his continued presence was increasingly dangerous, he escaped, stealing bread, cutting a phone line, and slipping into the darkness with 2 other prisoners. He made it out. He fought in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. He survived that too. After the war, he remained in Poland to gather intelligence on the Soviet-backed communist government now occupying his country. He was arrested in 1947, subjected to torture that his family said left him physically unrecognizable, tried on fabricated charges of espionage, and executed on May 25, 1948. His name was erased from Polish history for 4 decades. The communist government suppressed his story so thoroughly that most Poles of the next generation had never heard of him. It was not until 1990 that he was formally rehabilitated. In 2006, he was posthumously awarded Poland's highest state honor. He had volunteered for Auschwitz. He had built a resistance from inside the worst place on earth. He had survived, escaped, fought on, and when his country needed intelligence, he stayed, knowing the risk, accepting the cost. Witold Pilecki was not reckless. He was not suicidal. He was simply a man who believed that some things were worth any price and then proved that he meant it. A farmer, a teenage girl, a cavalry officer with a forged identity. None of them fit the template. None of them were supposed to be there. And yet, when history needed someone to hold the line, Each of them stepped forward without waiting for permission. Perhaps that's the pattern. Perhaps the most unlikely heroes aren't unlikely at all. Perhaps they're simply the ones who didn't stop to ask whether someone like them was qualified to try. Which of these three stories stayed with you the longest? Because the world has always been changed by people who had no business changing it.